All right, so I wanted to make a video on hand span and stretching the hand to increase one's hand span specifically. Now, this is a topic that I have made a full-length video on before, but it was a really long time ago, and I've been getting some comments on that video more recently, and just other comments on other videos. I thought this would be a really important conversation to have because I have a lot of new viewers that probably haven't seen that video. So I have 9 different points that I want to make, and each one of these is really important to understand if you play the piano, if you feel like your hands are small especially, or feel like increasing your hand span would really help you, then this video is for you. But even if you have large hands, this is also a video that you need to watch because there's a lot of misconceptions when it comes to playing the piano. People think if you have large hands, then you're made to play the piano. The reality is that this is completely false, okay? I've come across recently multiple amazing pianists who have very small hands, one of which is an Egyptian pianist, Wal Furik. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he's a very, very small man, and he has very small hands. On top of that, he actually has a disability in his hands, so that the ligaments in his hands are actually too short, so he can't actually make a full fist. And yet he plays Rachmaninoff concertos, anything you can possibly imagine. And that's a good testament to the fact that hand span or hand size has actually very little to do with playing the piano. It can be helpful in some situations, but in most situations, it actually doesn't matter. It actually can hinder you in many ways. So I have had a lot of students who have small hands, and I've had a few students who have big hands. And interestingly enough, the students that I've had with big hands, they actually have more trouble. And part of it is a psychological thing because they think, well, I have big hands. So I can just go to the keyboard and I can play, an octave with 1 and 3, right? And so they'll just do that all the time. And there's literally no need. Well, why wouldn't you just do this, right? Because this puts you in a very awkward position. It's very tense. Even if your hands are large, it's just very strange and awkward. And moving from one octave to something else, or going from one measure to the next, it's actually not ideal because no one plays like that. The composer who wrote this music didn't play like that. It's very strange. And so that's an observation I would make, that the students that I've had who have big hands, they do not play better. In fact, oftentimes they have more issues, they have more problems. But let's get into the 9 different points. So the first point that I want to make is active stretching versus passive stretching. Now, in that original video I made, there was a person who claimed to be an occupational therapist who said that, you're talking about stretching, because it's very common in the piano community to talk about opening the hand to an extreme position as stretching, right? And I've had people say, well, yeah, what else would you call that? And he basically, ripped me a new one, so to speak, because that's not stretching. Technically, a stretch is a passive thing. So if you stand, keep your legs straight, and bend forwards and touch your toes, that's a passive movement. The weight of your torso is actually pulling you sort of down, stretching your hamstrings, whatever. So let's be clear about what we're talking about here. Most of the time when people talk about stretching exercises to increase their hand span, they're not really talking about that kind of a stretch. They're talking about just opening the hand. So it's a very active sort of thing. However, sometimes people will use a passive stretch and they will seem to increase their hand span by a great margin. But the reason is they're doing a passive stretch. So for instance, if I try to open my hand, I can't, even on the edge of the keys, I can't really get a 10th, okay? I'm running into the D, in this case, the 9th, okay? However, watch this. If I take my hand and I let the piano actually open up my hand, all of a sudden I can get this clean 10th, right? So I let the piano kind of open my hand and I can do that, right? And people will do these kinds of stretches where they take the piano and they have the piano help them get some of these big intervals and whatnot, okay? So they'll use the piano to open the hand up. See, normally it's like I can't even open my hand to a sixth, but if I use the piano, all of a sudden I can. See that? Okay? That's the difference between actively trying to stretch the fingers apart, again, stretch the fingers apart, versus, let's say, more of a true stretch where it's a passive sort of stretch, okay? But let's think about this for a moment. People try and they say, oh, you know, a ninth is pretty uncomfortable for me, but then they do this and they go, after a while, it's like, oh, it becomes more and more comfortable. And so then they say, well, see, I increased my hand span. Well, the problem is that this, using the piano to open my hand like that, it's actually not practical in repertoire. When would you ever do that? When do you have the time to like, do that? And I actually literally have to have the keyboard to actually force my fifth finger open, okay? It's not practical in repertoire. So part of the problem is, and you'll see these kind of comments a lot online, and they'll say, well, now I can reach a tenth. In what context? That's the question. Because passively, you can open your hand, so to speak, or you can stretch your hand to a distance that you can't literally open your hand to. And that's the problem. People don't understand this. And they say, well, you know, I can reach a larger distance, right, because of these stretching exercises. I had one viewer, commenter, who said they were using a desktop and you know, whatever it is. But this is a very common thing. And they'll say, well, now, you know, I can reach a tenth, so therefore you're wrong. You can increase your hand span. Well, I never said that you couldn't. There are muscles in the hand that can be tight. There's one commenter who said, you know, a lot of times it's tight palmar fascia that just needs to be sort of massaged, and it can help loosen up, and you'll kind of help increase your span to a degree. It's not that you can't increase your hand span in any way, shape, or form. It's that there's a very small amount that you can practically do. And a lot of these stretching exercises, it's like people will do this. I've seen this, literally. I've seen this, okay? Between 1 and 2, oh, look at this. I can reach a sixth. When would you ever do that playing repertoire? When would you ever do that? Like, there's no way you can control that. It's no way you can, you know, practically get to that position. It's not useful, okay? Because it's this passive sort of thing, and when you actively try to open your hand, you just can't do that, okay? Now, the second point that I want to make has to do with the fourth finger. So most of us probably know that there's examples of people who have damaged their fourth finger by trying to lift it away from the other fingers. The famous example of Robert Schumann, some people say, I'm not really sure that that really happened, or they say, well, we're not sure that he really built a contraption with, you know, a rope or a cable that came down and held the fourth finger up while he practiced his other fingers, or held the third finger up while he practiced his fourth, or whatever it was. Like, maybe that didn't quite happen, but somehow he hurt his fourth finger. But on top of that, it's actually fairly common for people to injure their fourth finger from doing those kinds of things. That's a perfect example of how, you know, trying to stretch and pull against ligaments can actually tear them, right? And it's a really bad thing, okay? So a lot of times people think it's this almost like fear-mongering type thing where it's like, well, you're just trying to make people afraid of this thing, but it's fine. It's not a big deal. No, it is a big deal. And the fourth finger is a perfect example. And I have viewers, at least in the past, that have had this sort of thought process of like, well, okay, yeah, you got to be careful with the fourth finger, but all this other kind of stretching, pulling, yanking type sort of things, you know, pulling the fingers apart and whatever, like that's fine. That's different, right? Someone was saying, oh, well, you know, the ligaments on the fourth and fifth fingers, they're different. They're able to stretch more than the other fingers. And it's like, where are you getting this information? Okay, because I literally can't find it, which leads me to believe that someone told you, who knows where they heard it from. It's these wives' tales that just keep sort of circulating. So it is a very real thing, and you do need to be careful because people have permanently injured themselves through doing these kinds of things. Now, my third point is about pianist Garrick Olson. So I made a short a while ago where he is talking about hand span and hand size, and specifically talking about Chopin Opus 10 number 1. And the point that he makes in this video, which is just absolutely perfect, brilliant, because it's someone other than me who's literally making the points that I make in my videos all the time. And he says in the video, you know, even to this day, you know, people will say, well, I don't have a big enough hand, so I can't play, you know, Chopin Opus 10 number 1. And he goes on to say, but it has nothing to do with having a big hand. Like, yes, my hand is larger, so it's slightly easier in some ways. But he goes on to say that basically his hand is not, you know, because it's this interval of a tenth, right? He goes on to say basically that, you know, hand is never going to be like that. It's going to be in this little ball the whole time. And if you actually watch recordings of that, you'll notice that throughout, even the spots where I heard someone say you know, there's an E major chord that's just too wide, I just can't possibly play it fast or whatever, my hand's not big enough. Well, if you watch, even Garrick Olson, who has big hands, he doesn't play it like this, right? His hand is actually, he says it's kind of this little relaxed ball. It just sort of shifts along, okay? And that's a point that I've made in a lot of videos before, that playing the piano is not about how many notes you can play all at once, right? It's about movement. It's all about movement. And that's sort of the approach that I teach, and that actually quite a number of people teach. There's different versions of it, but there's a lot of really helpful information out there and teachers that know what they're talking about. And it's interesting how the people that really demonstrate themselves as being experts in the field and working with people and overcoming injury and all this thing, you know what they have all in common, even different versions of that, right? It's all about movement. It's all about how you move. It's about moving. It's not about reaching and stretching. And so I thought that, you know, it's from a longer lecture from Garrick Olson, but I thought it was absolutely brilliant because he makes this point, right? And so if you haven't seen the short, you should definitely check it out. And I provide a link to the actual full lecture. So it's great to watch. It's not all about technique, really. It's more about just Chopin in general, but great lecture to watch. So my next point is about tendons versus muscles, okay? So a number of people have, you know, commented things like, well, I mean, you say in the video that tendons don't stretch, and, you know, I stretched out my tendons because, look, I can reach a tenth and all these kinds of things, okay? So you can actually look this information up, right? Tendons actually don't stretch. They have elasticity to them, right? But they don't stretch out and become longer. That's a fantasy. That doesn't work like that. When you are stretching, for instance, and let's say you have a muscle that's attached to bone and then attached to a tendon that goes and does some sort of thing, right? Let's say in your leg or something. You're not actually stretching the tendon. The tendon isn't becoming longer. It's the muscle that's loosening and stretching out, okay? Muscle will actually, you know, stretch out and become longer. And the reason for this is because originally the muscles were longer, right? Look at little children, little kids. You know, I have 4 little kids. And it's amazing how flexible they are. And as they get older, they become less and less flexible. So my 1.5-year-old is incredibly flexible. My 4-year-old is much less flexible, actually. And that's what physical therapists, massage therapists, other physicians will tell you, or medical professionals. What they'll tell you is that if you don't make use of that range of motion, you'll actually lose it. Your muscles will slowly get tighter and tighter, okay? So when you're stretching, you have to think about, well, am I trying to pull against a tendon? Am I just pulling against these ligaments? You know, think about like if I try to move my wrist so that my fingers touch my arm. Some people might be hypermobile like that, which is oftentimes actually a defect. It's ligaments that are, you know, kind of not messed up, but they're just not the way most people are. And it's actually not necessarily a good thing. People who have hypermobile joints actually have a lot of joint pain and other issues because it's hard for their bodies to stabilize those joints correctly because the ligaments are just different. You know, they don't function, quote unquote, properly, if you will. But imagine if I try to pull my wrist so my fingers can touch my arm. Virtually anyone watching this video would say, well, you'll hurt yourself. Exactly. Because I'm not just stretching muscles, I'm actually pulling against tendons and ligaments, and they don't stretch, they don't become longer, okay? So we all have had an experience of, you can stretch muscles, like for instance, anyone, unless you have some sort of disability or some problem, you can learn to do the splits. What you're doing is you're increasing flexibility of muscles, right? I had someone who commented on the video and said something to the effect of, well, can someone explain to me how ballerinas or, acrobats, how they can do the splits and not rip their tendons to shreds and ligaments or whatever. It's like, well, it's because the human body is capable of that. Again, with my baby or my little kids, they're incredibly flexible. You have that when you're born, your muscles are loose, okay? And you don't have all these tense muscles, and that's a normal thing, right? Because you're not stretching tendons, you're stretching muscles. You're increasing the flexibility in that sense, right? So that's an important thing to realize. Most of the time, like for instance, I would say if you really desperately want to do stretching exercises, that's fine. Understand what you're stretching. What muscles are you actually stretching? What are you doing? Like the person that comments who allegedly is a doctor and says, well, it might be tight palmar fascia and you can kind of massage and get it to loosen up, right? What are they talking about? Muscles. You know what they also said in the comment? Tendons do not stretch. They don't become longer. You can't stretch them out is the point, okay? So you have to think about these things. You have to actually understand it. If you just mindlessly start pulling and stretching, the chances of you hurting yourself are very high. And again, it's not that you couldn't slightly influence how far you can reach. I mean, when I was 20, let's say, I could not even use the piano to open my hand to an 11th. That would have hurt. Part of it is, again, how you're doing that, okay? It's like, for instance, a ninth. A ninth is actually fairly comfortable for me, but it's, again, because of how I'm doing it. It's not because, oh, I've just increased my handspin. Yes, there's a tiny bit of truth to that, tiny bit of truth. But what you'll notice, and I see this in comments all the time, well, I got to a 10th, and now I can do 11th, and I'm almost to a 12th. It's like this never-ending thing because people do not understand that you can't just keep going for virtually ever, okay? And this actually ties into some of my later points, but we'll wait for that, okay? The next point is that you cannot influence the length of your fingers. And this might seem like a strange one. You're like, well yeah, I'll be. Well, actually, no. I came across a number of comments where people are under the impression that you can. For instance, one commenter says, well, the fingers on my left hand are longer than my right hand. And my left hand, I've done all these stretching exercises, played all these big 10th chords. So, your body just adapts. And there's a number of people that commented and were like, well, my right foot's longer than my left foot. Like, what's your point though? And the person went on to basically defend this position that, well, you can increase the length of your fingers. You can influence that. And that is a fantasy, okay? If that were true, people who are short, who are self-conscious about it, they would just influence their bodies to get taller, okay? It's not true. It doesn't work like that. It's genetics. It's all in genetics. If there's a person whose fingers on their left hand are longer than their right hand, that has to do with their genetics, not because of stretching exercises. And again, even as I'm talking, it almost seems silly to make this point because it's like, well, everyone knows this. Well, apparently not. There are people who mistakenly think that you can influence that, okay? That is not true. If that were true, again, all professional pianists would have massively huge hands, which is another thing that I've heard people say. I've heard people say, well, back in the 19th century, people had more average size hands, but as piano as repertoire became more and more technically demanding and bigger distances between notes, nowadays people have massive hands, and every concert pianist can easily reach it, you know, a 10th or even an 11th or whatever. And again, the person did not, in this particular comment that I'm thinking of, they did not directly say that their people's hands have gotten bigger, but I think that's directly implied. It's directly implied. As the music gets more complicated, your hands just get bigger, your fingers get longer, all this stuff. But you don't see that. And you don't see concert pianists saying, well, you know, I used to have fingers that were X length and now they're like 50% longer. It's like, you know, they're like freaking a foot long or something. Like, that's not a thing, okay? And again, it feels silly to say this, but I have gotten these comments, so it's kind of important to say. The next point that I have is that no one who plays well plays like this with their hands stretched out. And this goes back to the Chopin Opus 10 number 1. I see this from time to time, amateur recordings online. Sometimes people will send me videos asking, hey, can you help me out with this passage? And normally what I find is people are trying to play like this, with the hands stretched out as much as possible. And I understand that because those ideas are so common. They're a dime a dozen, right? I mean, it's just, they're so commonplace that it's normal to have these kinds of thoughts or this understanding about playing the piano. And I used to play like this too. But if you actually watch professional pianists play, they don't play like that. They don't play like that, okay? You know, even if they play a big chord or something, right? Which, okay, there's a 10th, again, on the edge, and I'm kind of using the keyboard to actually open my hand like that. But it's like, even if I play this, and I have another chord, I'm not going to move like this, okay? I'm going to do this, and I'm going to release my hand, and then I'm going to sort of open it again, okay? And that's actually the biggest point there, is that the hand opens to the demands of the music. But as much as possible, as Garrick Olson says in this video that I mentioned, it's just a little ball. It's just a relaxed little ball. That's how you have to play, right? And this is so important because I think this goes back to the concept, the idea that it really doesn't matter, right? If someone says I can only reach an octave, that's fine. That's fine. That doesn't matter, okay? Because you don't have to reach more than an octave. You know, again, passively, even if you have small hands, you can use the keyboard to open your hand more, okay? However, there are many examples of famous pianists that have tiny hands, and yet they play all of the repertoire you can imagine. I mean, one pianist I was doing some research on recently, Ashkenazi, according to the sources I found, he could only reach a 9th, and yet he played and actually recorded the entire works of Rachmaninoff. So think about that for a second, right? The one specific composer who's known for these huge chords and you have to have massive hands to play. Again, these ideas are everywhere. Everyone says if you have small hands, you just can't play much Rachmaninoff. And yet, here's a pianist who, according to what I found, could barely reach a 9th, okay? Probably, maybe similar to me. Again, I can kind of do it over the white keys, although you can see I'm slightly putting down the E, and so it's actually really difficult to do that. On the black keys, I can do that fine, okay? And yet, that's considered an average hand. That's not even considered a large hand, okay? When it comes to playing piano. And it's like, Ashkenazi recorded the entire works of Chopin, right? And no one thinks there's anything defective about his recordings, even though he, according to his own words, if he can't reach a chord, he'll just gently roll it. And I've listened to enough of his recordings and, you know, looked at the scores and really thought about what he's actually doing. And he does it very well. You wouldn't really notice, you wouldn't think about it. Incredibly artistic performances. And so that's a really, really important thing, again, that people who play well, if you watch them, slow the recordings down, look what they're actually doing. They're not playing with their hand like this, okay? There's very few situations where having a big hand is actually an asset. And Chopin, excuse me, Opus 10 number 1 is not one of them, okay? So another thing, or my next point, is that you'll see many comments online about Chopin, Opus 10 number 1, helping people increase their hand span. And this is completely wrong. Again, completely false. I kind of already alluded to this, but I want to make a separate point on this, okay? Nobody who plays it well has their hand open more than an octave. And you can check this out if you want. Find some recordings online where you can see a downward view. There's a recording of Garrick Olson performing it back when he was young, probably in the 70s. And you'll notice that his hand is not like that. I mean, he can reach a tenth easily. He has big hands. His hand is never open that much, not even once. And if any of you are skeptical about this, please go watch the recording. You can find it on YouTube. Slow it down, and you will find that I'm completely right. His hand is never open more than an octave, okay? So the commenters that will say this online, they'll say, well, really help me increase my hand span, whatever. I can pretty much guarantee that these people did not play it well, because what it means is that they do not understand how technique functions. They do not understand how to play the etude, and so I feel confident that I can guarantee they did not play it well, okay? Because again, all the professional pianists who play it at breakneck speed, have perfect control and evenness, they do not play it like that. And there's a reason why they don't. Playing the piano is not about the size of your hand, it's about movement. Very important, okay? So my next point, which I kind of alluded to, but I wanted, again, it's kind of a separate point here, but string players who have longer fingers on their left hands, and you think, okay, hold on a second. We're talking about piano, or are we talking about string players? Well, this is a particular comment that I got on a video where they were talking about, basically you can increase your hand span and you can even increase the length of your fingers. Again, it goes back to that wives' tale. And it's basically, again, the idea that your hand will just adapt to the environment that it's in. I hope that at this point you all realize that this is not true, okay? Your hand will adapt to the environment that it's in. Your body will, to a degree, okay? It's sort of like, for instance, runners tend to be very lean. Weightlifters tend to be less lean, but more muscular. People who lift really, really heavy weights tend to be very big, large sort of people, right? However, there is a limit to this, and it's called genetics, okay? So it's kind of the same thing. You might find one person online, and in reality, they increase their hand span from an octave to a 12th, let's say. And it might be that they have very hypermobile joints. And so they could do this in a way that didn't hurt them, okay? But for the average person, this is not going to happen. It's like, for instance, you see these bodybuilders, right? And they're huge, they're massively huge. And let's say they're natural, so they're not taking steroids, okay? It doesn't mean every person can attain that. There are some people, like Ronnie Coleman, before he was taking steroids, the guy was huge, insanely big for someone who's not taking steroids, okay? And then he took steroids and he was like mind-bogglingly huge, just like insane. Like if you look at pictures of him next to like normal people, you're like, oh my gosh, it's like, it literally is like, how is it possible? Well, not every person can even get to that level. Even people that take steroids can't necessarily get there because, again, genetics plays a huge role in this. So you have to be very careful online when you see someone say, well, I did X, Y, Z. Well, there's so many variables. It's very difficult for me to say, first of all, whether or not it's just a passive sort of thing. Like, for instance, using the keyboard to open your hand up, again, is that what they mean? If they say, I can play a sixth with fingers 2 and 3. Again, as I mentioned, when would you ever want to do that? That's pointless. But again, is it just doing this? Can they actually just open their fingers and then just, play a sixth like that? What's the context? Who knows? But let's say there's even a person online who can do this. Well, maybe they have hypermobile joints. The pianist that I mentioned in the beginning of the video, Wal Furk, again, I'm not sure that I'm pronouncing that right, but you know, the ligaments in his hand are too short, so he can't make a fist more than about this, right? And it's sort of like because of that, you know, that changes things. So you can have someone who has hypermobile joints and they seemingly did this. But you have to be very careful because, again, there's so many variables. It's impossible to say whether, you know, what's the context of what they're talking about, and is there something about their genetics or their anatomy that enables them to be able to do this. And that's why I would say that for the most part, I would not recommend stretching exercises. I've never done stretching exercises. I don't have large hands, okay? I have slightly above average size hands. And it doesn't actually, it's no detriment to my piano playing, okay? Because playing the piano is all about movement. And furthermore, as I mentioned, and we don't really have time to go into this too much, but it's really not so much about how far you can reach or stretching or anything like that. It's how you do it, right? A lot of times people will try to play an octave like this. It's this very tense, awkward thing. And if they just played an octave like this, they'd find it's more comfortable, okay? Same thing is with, you know, big chords or something, right? You can see how my hand is tipped to the side. If I try to play that totally flat, it's very awkward. Here, tipped to the side, depending on the context of the chord, I might be more tipped on the side. It's very comfortable, it's normal. And I don't even purposely do this. See here, now I'm more flat, okay? But the context of the actual intervals and the notes will determine the position of the hand. So it's not even so much, you know, the reach, but it's how you get there. I've heard people make the point that if your hand is sideways like this, you can reach much farther, and it feels different. See, this feels very uncomfortable. This doesn't feel as uncomfortable. It feels very different, right? If I have my hand sideways like this versus like this, it feels totally different. So a lot of it has to do with how you're playing a big chord, not, you know, how big your hand is or stretching and all this kind of stuff. So as a general principle, I would not recommend anyone do these kinds of stretching exercises. I would learn how to keep your hand like this as much as possible. The hand opens and closes, and as a general principle, it stays like this. When you play an arpeggio, you're not playing it like this, okay? You'll never really be able to play well if you play like that. You're going to play like this. And again, if you watch recordings of famous pianists, people that play really well and don't have problems, they don't have injuries, they're good, you'll notice that that's how they play. So I hope that these points were interesting. I hope that you learned something. And ultimately, I hope that we can use this information to help dispel some of these myths about piano playing. And if you did learn something, if you thought it was interesting, leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a great day.